Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Wehle, and this is Simple Politics. My guest today is my friend, colleague, and mentor, professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, Michael Meyerson, who's the author of a number of books on the United States Constitution, including most recently a book called Endowed by Our Creator. So he's a constitutional law expert, but mostly he's a master educator. He's really the best of the best. And so I invited Mike to come today so that we all can get a taste of what we need to really understand about our constitutional system in plain language. Mike, thank you so much for coming on Civil Politics today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. If I'm your mentor, you have certainly exceeded all the things a mentor could hope for. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for that. So just as to begin with, Mike, I know that obviously it takes an entire semester, or multiple semesters really, to teach constitutional law, and you don't get it all, even in law school. What do you think are the myths about the Constitution that people come into law school with, the key ones? And I guess the flip side of that question is, what do people really need to understand about the Constitution that they don't walking around the streets of America?
I think the hardest part about the Constitution is that it's not simple. And I think people expect there to be simple answers to difficult questions. And the moment they run into how difficult it is, they begin to realize that the document is incredibly short. It's an incredibly short document, and was designed, as they said, to last forever. And you don't get all the answers in this 5-6 page document. So I think the hardest thing to realize is how much work it is to get an answer for today out of a document written hundreds of years ago.
Well, you're sounding a bit to me like what some people would call, a living constitutionalist. Are you suggesting that it's a living, breathing document? Because a lot of people hear about this concept of originalism or textualism. It tends to be associated with, the right, conservatives. That is, there's one way to read the Constitution. For example, abortion isn't in it. It's built on a pile of sand. So what do you mean when you say, oh, it's short and complex,
Okay.
really? Are you in a
Well,
camp? Are you in a political camp, Mike?
I truly believe there is no like theory of everything. It's not in physics, and it certainly isn't in law. There is no one way to read the document. The point is, you have a document with relatively few words that we must interpret in some way to describe hundreds, thousands of different possible issues. So how you interpret those words is open for debate. The fact that we need to interpret those words is really the hardest thing for people to understand. It's not simple. Most of the stuff isn't there in simple. We have two houses, House and Senate, that I know for certain. The rest is sort of just a hope and a prayer.
Well, the rest. Okay, so let's start. When I talk about this, I start with this notion of structure. So what some people call the separation of powers, and then we have something that are called rights. Most people think about rights, and I want to put that on the back burner for now. Can you tell us what is it about the structure? What do people need to understand about the structure of the Constitution? And how is it different from other structures that tend to be hierarchical, right? A management structure at your job, for example. What do we mean by the structural constitution and the separation of powers?
Right. So when the framers wrote in 1787 the Constitution, there were no rights. It was all about the structure. The theory was, if you design something carefully enough, the kind of rights and liberty and freedom will take care of itself. So the theory is, you need a government that works and is limited if you're going to have any rights at all. Only later did they add the Bill of Rights, and only after the Civil War did they put equality into the Constitution. But if you look at a dictatorship, it could have the most wonderful list of rights, but if the structure permits one person to be in charge, call him Putin, for example, for hypothetical purposes, then all the rights listed in that Russian Constitution are worthless as they lock up reporters and they torture and kill people. You need a structure before you can have rights. And that's really different, because it's so easy to focus on how rights affect us. They're really important, but without a structure, you have no protection at all.
So how does, in theory, and then I want to talk about how well it's doing today, how in theory, Mike, does the structure of the Constitution protect our rights?
Okay, so one of my favorite quotes from James Madison, who wrote much of the Constitution, at least in some form, is the following quote: "Whoever has power is liable to abuse it." So the Constitution is based on distrust in many ways of people in power, an incredibly modern view as well. So the theory is, this is another quote I liked, was ambition has to battle ambition. How do you stop a president from going crazy? Well, you have the courts, you have the Congress or the courts, and they all want more power. You don't presuppose moral people. You presuppose ambitious people. And I'm not going to let you win the game because I want to play the game as well. So the simplest structure is simply everyone has to be involved before things can happen. That's the theory.
Okay, so let's break it down a little bit more. Constitution 101. How is the presidency then checked? How is the power of the presidency checked under the structure of the Constitution?
Okay, in a lot of different ways, though there's always the sense that the sword belongs to whoever wants to pick it up. Keeping that in mind, the number one way we actually saw is with impeachment. The House and Senate can, if they get the proper number of votes, and in the Senate that's 2/3, which is a whole lot, they can fire the president. President can't fire Congress. Congress has that power. Second of all, as you watch bills going down, you may not like it, but Congress can say, we're not going to pass this law. And so presidents don't have the power to make law, make rules, impose taxes. That has to come from the legislature. So in many ways, you have the legislative branch, House and Senate, having the power to limit what the president does. But you need the guts to use that power.
Right. So if it's there and it's not used, it's meaningless. We'll go back to that. Let's flip it. How do you keep the Congress? And first of all, what did the framers think about the Congress? And how do you keep the Congress from having too much power as compared to the other two branches, the presidency and the federal judges?
Well, when you talk about having too much power, there are two ways to think about the power. As anyone watching the last several years knows, most of the power is to do nothing. The power that Congress really has is to stop things from happening, whether it's, you see it in voting rights, you see it in a lot of human rights, you see it in a lot of issues. So Congress can stop things, and it's very hard to get them to move if they don't want to. If, on the other hand, they want to do something that may be crazy stupid, or even something you want, the president can veto a law, a proposal, a bill. And then Congress needs a 2/3 vote in each house to override the veto. And now people may not like the math, but 2/3 is a lot. How much is it? In the last 200 years, we have never had the Senate controlled by more than by 2/3 of a party. You always need the other party to get to 2/3. It's a lot of agreement. And if the Congress and the president agree, then you go to the court. The court is supposed to be the final stop and say, you cannot do this because it violates our fundamental charter, the Constitution.
So how does Congress stop the president then?
Well, again, number one, as you said a moment ago, they have to have the will. Without the will, the system falls apart. There is no doubt about that. And we've seen that periodically in the last several years where, a president want to do something and Congress say, oh, go ahead. You want to invade, you want to go to war. Sure, we have the power to declare war. You go do what you want. And that's really dangerous. So if you have the political will or the political ambition, you can pass a law. And you sort of saw this, you see it with gay rights, for example. Congress can pass a law saying, either furthering gay rights and trans rights or limiting them. Congress's law ability to make rules is an incredibly powerful tool.
And then the last piece is the courts, which have become, very, I think, polarized. Even the United States Supreme Court, they're not elected, right? They're the one branch of the three that are not elected. So doesn't that seem like the courts have too much power? And of course, we're seeing, people are on the edge of their seats to see what happens in the Dobbs case to abortion rights, but we've also seen it basically be obliterated already in Texas. It seems like this Supreme Court is the sovereign now. So how do you justify that under the original understanding of the structure that you say, and I agree with you, is designed to protect individual rights?
Okay, so the theory Again, I'm not going to justify the court. That's asking a lot of me. But at least let's explain the
Yeah,
original
yeah.
theory. The original theory. The original theory was that democracy is our only hope, but also a terrifying risk. Why? Because a majority can easily become a tyrant to the minority. We saw that with slavery. We saw that with Jim Crow. We can see it now in various places where they're passing anti-trans laws. We've seen that. So the court is not just not elected. I think to me, the most important thing is they can't be voted out. So if I'm in Congress, if I'm the president, I want re-election, I'm going to cater to the majority. Now, sometimes that's essential and sometimes democracy works, but the court is designed to be the ones to stop the majority from being oppressive. And if you look at Brown versus Board of Education, you look at the fundamental rules, even on criminal procedure, Miranda warnings that people know about. There are a lot of ways the weakest part of society was empowered by this unelected branch.
But you started, Mike, talking about how the Constitution doesn't have everything spelled out and that the court does that. So are we relying on these justices to identify what our rights are? And that's, I think, scary to people, because why should it be that five people that are unelected, they're there for life, are now sitting in a posture where I think for the first time probably in American history, we are seeing potentially a right being snatched away. That is the right, and people talk about the right to abortion, but it's not so much that. I mean, as a mom of four, it's the right to decide for myself what happens with my body. That, and it's, or within, my family or my spouse or my religion, but not a government, right? We can have a debate as to whether this is morally okay, religiously, whatever, but the idea is government, right? So how are we in this position? I know I'm not asking you to justify it, Mike, but people are really worried about it. Our viewers are scared about abortion. They're scared about the U.S. Supreme Court. So what is it? What are the checks on the court? Why is it that these folks who are put on the court these days without any, with the exception of Justice Jackson, the three before that, with no Democratic support, no bipartisan support, that they get to decide what the Constitution protects?
Okay, so let me start off with the first thing you said, which is you should be concerned, because freedom is scary always. So we've talked about this, that it's not a guarantee. We have the longest lasting written constitution in the world, but no way is it certain that things survive, that freedom survives. So it's always a risk, and you're always depending on people, which is really scary. Because whether it's personal or governmental, people don't always come through, and greedy people, evil people, stupid people can cause all sorts of trouble. So you start off with that. But let me point out something interesting. If the Supreme Court does away with the right to abortion, you only lose the right to abortion if state legislators vote to take it away. So in Maryland, we've just expanded protection for abortion. So the problem is still democracy. The problem is you have people in Texas, a majority, or in Florida or in other states now voting to take away the right. So to say it's the court's fault, it's only because they're not protecting us from the majority. But the real problem on abortion is just an example, is what voters are doing or what legislators think voters want. The problem is the majority here, not the court.
But haven't there been times, Mike, and I know you're also a scholar of constitutional history, legal history, haven't there been times, like take the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution? We're going to talk about rights in a minute, but for viewers, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, 13th Amendment banning enslavement of human beings, 15th Amendment giving what amounted to black males the right to vote. 14th Amendment has a lot of stuff in there, something called the Equal Protection Clause, Due Process Clause, etc. Haven't there been times where the states have kind of run roughshod over the Constitution, and the political process didn't really work, and people still don't have their rights? So you need the court to come in?
Yes, absolutely. So when I'm growing up, the phrase states' rights was equivalent to racists. Who were the states' rights? Those were the people like Strom Thurmond and other people from the past who said, let the states treat blacks as second-class citizens. Let us have segregated schools. So states' rights were, to me growing up and as a young lawyer, just evil. Then, of course, Massachusetts starts legalizing gay marriage. I'm going, gee, maybe it's not so bad all the time. Maybe when Congress is being run by people who don't care, maybe the states can, the phrase is, be laboratories for experiments. So the thing is that in a period of history, the states have been obviously horrible. Jim Crow laws mandating that blacks be treated as second-class citizens were the problem of the states. But whether you want to talk about marijuana legalization, whether you want to talk about gay rights, that's only because the states were free to act independently. So you have multiple levels of government, and in my opinion, it's because you never know where the tyrant is. So you
So
need,
all of this push and pull is part of it. No, there's no place where you don't know where the tyrant is, and no one's wearing the white hat all the time.
there is no part of the structure that wears the white hat all the time. Absolutely not. So you need to have, well, if this place is taken over by bad guys, I got to be able to go there. That's the system to make it difficult to have, as in Russia, one person in charge. The whole theory of separating powers, what we've called federalism, states issues, is to have multiple ways to push back on power.
And you mentioned a lot Russia and Putin, and I think that's important because one thing I encounter in talking to people that don't necessarily have expertise with the Constitution, one is this notion that there's a clear way to read it, and there's the right way and the wrong way, and it sounds like we agree that that's just not realistic and that's not how it works. But the other is that, it's America. We've got rights and freedoms and liberties, and we're not Russia. We're not Ukraine. That could never happen to us. How do you respond to that?
Well, sadly, looking at history, we've seen it happen to at least part of us. In the late 1800s, when the victories of the Civil War were being sort of rewritten, suddenly blacks lost all right to vote. They went from having the ability to put people into a legislature to having 3,000 blacks able to vote in the state of Louisiana. It is possible to lose rights. And of course, it's possible to limit who's allowed to vote. It's possible to limit who's allowed to be free. And once that starts, as we've seen in Europe, it's not that hard to whittle away, and fewer and fewer people end up having rights. So nothing is historically guaranteed, even though we say rights are guaranteed by the Constitution.
Well, we've heard also a lot recently about Black Lives Matter, criminal justice. Race has become a front and center conversation. Of course, it's always been that way in America, but the presidency of Donald Trump kind of put it back on the front burner with what happened in Charlottesville, kind of tolerating racism. I wonder if some people think, though, Mike, well, yeah, people of color have always struggled for equal rights, but for others that have never been in that position, it's not going to touch me. It's not going to affect my life. And of course, I'm a white female, so I'll speak just for myself. And I'm using this rhetorically, not because I believe it, but I think, it still seems so far off and so just unimaginable that rights our our collective rights, because there have been many times that lots of people in America, people of color, have never had rights. What kinds of things, Mike, when you say rights, what are we talking about that could surprise people, that could go? I mean, again, people of color have struggled from day one with their 400 years of enslaving human beings. I'm not justifying that, but I'm trying to make the case, or ask you to make the case, for non-people of color in America who just assume I'll always have my rights.
Well, I think we've talked from abortion. I think women can lose all sorts of rights of let's call it at minimum bodily integrity. But you can lose other rights as well. You can lose the right of access to the courts. So you can't go to court when an employer fires you for being pregnant, for example. You need access to the courts, among other things. Religion. I mean, there's one religion, another religion, and, the history of religious hatred, Muslims, Jews, others, there's a vulnerability there. So history has shown that it's really easy to pick one target or another, or more likely one target after another. But I think what we've seen is it's the same. I'm not a no one has rights or it's always been awful. I think you also have progress. I think the world in many ways is better than it was in the 1950s. Is it good enough? Not even close. I mean, Black Lives Matter, if people are still getting killed on the streets, that's still wrong. But there are different ways of having dialogue, different ways of seeing representation. Justice Jackson is just going to be an example. I wish we didn't have Jackie Robinson moments anymore. I wish we didn't have the first any. It's way past all of that. But as we slowly move and we have our victories, I think it's a major psychological mistake to not celebrate victories, not celebrate progress, even when it's not enough.
I agree with you. So we can't just focus on the negative and say, until I have all of it, I'm not going to feel good about any of it. But let's go back to the constitutional conversation. We mentioned the structure, the three branches of government, no concentrated power in one place, the idea that it's human nature to amass and entrench and abuse power, so we need to have lots of layers of it. Why, if that was supposed to work, Mike, did the framers add the Bill of Rights? And what is the Bill of Rights?
Okay, so the Bill of Rights originally was only for the federal government. The federal government wasn't allowed to limit speech. The federal government wasn't allowed to establish a Church of England in the United States. A federal government could not take away criminal jury trials. So the original plan was to limit the evil the Congress could do. After the Civil War and after the 14th Amendment, those rights began to apply to everyone. But I think the theory, what people realized really quickly is structure isn't enough. You can't depend on a structured government to work. We've all seen it in our lifetimes. I don't care how young you are, you have seen parts of the government not work. And so therefore you need to have something that people can intuit. And you don't have to be a law professor to say, I'm an American, this is wrong. That feeling, and that's what the Constitution does, says a majority cannot vote to take away my right to do X. I'm an American. And that feeling, whatever you may think of anything else, that's a powerful limit on what government can do. And that's why rights are so important.
So, what is written in the Constitution that's affirmative rights? And what rights would you say people think they have but aren't expressed in the Constitution? You can't find the words, but they're bound up in this idea of I'm American and I have this.
Okay, so the First Amendment begins with guarantees of religious freedom and freedom of expression. And that's explicit on both. Now, of course, what does freedom of speech mean in the internet age gets more and more complicated. And whose speech is it? Is Twitter's ability to control your speech? Who's the speaker? These become incredibly complicated. But the absolute right to speak and pray as you will is absolutely explicit.
Just to clarify, as compared to government interference, right? It's not like if you work for Amazon, you have free speech.
Correct. Okay. And you asked early on, what's one of the things people don't understand? The Constitution only limits government. If right now on your show, you decide to silence me because you don't like what I'm saying, you have limited my ability to speak, but you have not violated my First Amendment rights. You can't silence me unconstitutionally, even though you could very effectively silence me. So it's only, that's exactly right. So it's only about limiting government. That's what constitutions do. They limit government. So by the way, people are going to always wonder, so a private person can't discriminate. That's because of a statute, a law. So we are governed by two sets of rules. The government is governed by the Constitution. You and me, we're governed by the laws passed by the Maryland state legislature in Maryland, the federal the Congress for the nation.
Okay, so that I think is a really important distinction. But we talked about free speech, freedom of expression, another free speech, basically, freedom of religion. What other things, Mike, are you mentioned clear into the Constitution, written in black and white in the Bill of Rights, and then in subsequent amendments so that they bind both the federal and the state government? What's written in stone? Okay,
so you have lots of criminal protections, no double jeopardy. You can't be tried twice for the same crime, right to counsel, that's no cruel and unusual punishment. But I think the rights that probably affect most people most are the ones that came into clear view after the Civil War. And one is the Equal Protection Clause you read, which is the government must treat similarly situated people the same, whatever that may mean. Second is what's called the Due Process Clause, which, forgetting the history, basically guarantees some concept of liberty. Something it is to be, sometimes you'll hear a phrase, ordered liberty. What does it mean to be a free person in society? And that's where things like the implied right of abortion come from. Implied right to use contraception come from is the sense of liberty. So equality and liberty become the two most powerful concepts when most people think of rights today.
But that's really different from when you mentioned, the First Amendment that specifies religion, that specifies speech, that specifies association, or the Second Amendment, which I know there's a debate as to the right to bear arms, how broad that right is, but it does say right to bear arms. Whereas when you're talking about equal protection or liberty due process, right, they're not defined.
That's right. And so one way to think about this is that many of the people who wrote the Constitution had this view that before there was a Constitution, there were rights. Declaration of Independence, we are endowed with inalienable rights. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. Now, it's not legally binding as a document. It was really like a hate letter to the king. But what the Declaration of Independence establishes is a mindset that before there was a United States of America, there were these rights that all free people must have. They didn't define them. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we are still defining what those rights are to be a free person or a free person in America.
So, in the concept of equal protection due process, you mentioned abortion, which I think there's a myth rolling around that that's somehow some made up right, but it's bound up in this concept of liberty in the 14th Amendment. Is the right to decide how to raise your children anywhere articulated, Mike, in the Constitution?
No, and when it's not mentioned at all, but when the Supreme Court, and this is 100 years ago, in the 1920s, started talking about a right of parents to raise children, it was because families pre-existed the Constitution, that the image that a parent had the right, I'd argue the duty, to raise their child to the best of their ability precedes the Constitution. You did not need a Constitution for a parent to have the right to raise their children.
Well, what about the ability to terminate a pregnancy then? Is that kind of more of a modern concept? So we should bifurcate it based on what happened prior to the Constitution? Or I think, how do you define, okay, what is protected and what isn't protected if we don't have a definition of liberty?
Well, I think that's the key question. How do you define it when it's not written down as you put it in black and white? And I think even though the right of abortion, and history is actually far more complicated than yes or no. It's just a really complicated story. But here's what's not complicated. There was always a sense that people had the right to control their body. Sometimes the phrase is bodily integrity. You can't make me take this medicine, for example.
So that's not in the Constitution. Like,
exactly,
government rings your doorbell and says, you must get this surgery, or you must take this medicine, or you must take the vaccine, or else you'll go to jail.
That's right.
For examtle.
Oh, I think that's absolutely. Now, vaccines get all complicated because you have other people's rights. If you're in prison, if you're in the military, it gets. But yes, you're absolutely right. Even though it isn't written down, it was understood as to be a free person. You could say, leave my body alone. And once you start from that as, let's call it historical, then the question is, well, how far do we take it? And do we now have an understanding? Or you could go on equality. Remember, when the Constitution is written and the 14th Amendment after the Civil War is written, no one who was writing thought women deserved equal play. No one thought they were equal. And so now that we think, well, you can't have equality without women being equal, it's a no-brainer now. So what does that mean for a woman's right to control her body? So abortion actually is like a cross-section of two important rights. It's the old right to control your body, And it's also the right of women to be equal in society and equally able to control their destiny. So again, it's not written down. You don't see abortion in the Constitution, but the constitutional protections of body and guarantee of equality, that's where you find it.
So how does this affect, and besides, say you're not a woman of childbearing age, um, or you don't plan to have kids, or you don't have kids, so you don't care about the right to raise your kids. Are there other kinds of rights that are bound up in a concept of liberty but not articulated, that people might be surprised that you kind of want to protect the structure, or this might go, we might be in Putin land when it comes to this thing that's not written down in the Constitution? Set abortion aside, this one is also not written down, to be careful what you wish for. There's some others, Mike, that come to mind.
Well, I think the whole gay rights movement is bottomed on that. That it's a sense that whether or not it's equality or personal autonomy, then the court has lots of phrases they throw out, that the idea that a gay couple can marry is a relatively recently held decision by the court that is based on a sense of both equality and bodily integrity. I think that you have a lot of issues involving medical care, a lot about raising your kids, the ability to.
So when you talk about gay, sorry to interrupt, but just to put a pin in this, when you talk about gay marriage, you talk about abortion, that sounds awfully left. Are there things that people moderate or more ideologically right on the right end of the spectrum that also could be vulnerable if the structure falls?
Sure. How about your right to send your kid to a private or religious school? The right to send your kid to a private school, not to a public governmentally run school, is not written down.
But so government could come in and say, if you're going to educate your kid, it's got to be the way we say it.
Or you have no choice but to educate your kid the way we said. We'll call them education camps. We've seen that in other parts of the world. So if you want to raise your kid a certain way, and that includes homeschooling, I would argue that all of that movement is protected by these sort of unenumerated, if you will, or unlisted rights. I think absolutely that's the clearest and simplest, that I would think of.
Okay, so we've established, I hope, for people an understanding that the Constitution is not set in stone, that a lot of rights that we properly assume belong to us aren't articulated in the Constitution, that we hope the Supreme Court does the right thing. If not, we've got other branches. I want to talk about voting, right? Justice Amy Coney Barrett has talked about voting as a civic right that somehow is less protected than an individual right, the rights we've been talking about. How does voting play into this whole thing? And what do you say to young people in particular, say, why bother voting? It's completely, it's twisted. It's so gerrymandered. My vote doesn't matter anymore anyway. And all of these people in office are corrupt. So it's just not for me.
I'd say you're 98% correct. It is a corrupt system. Often the vote doesn't matter. Yet, if we give up that vote, if you willingly stop voting, you are ceding power, and you're ceding all political power. And then you got nothing. What we have seen historically is the way Blacks were reoppressed in the early 20th century was by taking away their vote. Women were completely subject to men because they did not have the vote. Young people were being drafted into the Vietnam War because they did not have the right to vote. And you're seeing it now that if you take away the right to vote, you take away so much, whether you want to call it schooling, where highways are built, climate change, whatever you care about depends on a political process working. And here's the most difficult part. It doesn't work. But if you stop voting and stop working to increase the vote, then you give power away and you may not be able to get it back. Again, if they got the guns and they got the courts and you don't have the vote, I don't know where your power is going to come from, except like you're going to just write a tweet and you'll be sad. I think power is action and voting is essential. And we've even seen in the last couple of years. The other thing is, don't be so sure it doesn't matter. Don't be so sure you can read the future. All sorts of surprises have happened. And maybe this is just being optimistic, but the vote is the last thing I would ever want to give up. And I would fight for voting more than any other right we got in America, because everything else depends on that.
Well, then how do you respond to Justice Amy Coney Barrett, that it's a civic right, it doesn't really matter, it's not that protected, and not just her, right? The Chief Justice has also not been a fan of voting rights. We saw Justice Alito write an opinion that added a bunch of criteria to the Voting Rights Act to make it harder for people to vote. So when you look at this voting spectrum, right, and you see corrupt politicians, you see tons of money, dark money coming in, flowing in from big corporations, foreign governments. You see gerrymandering where you can vote to your heart's content, but you're never going to get your party or your candidate in there because the system is rigged. You're seeing term limits, and then you see a Supreme Court that is there for life, that's just going to hammer voting rights when it comes before them. What's the path, Mike, out of the darkness? Where's the flashlight
Okay,
for someone
okay.
who's 20? And I'll tell you, I mean, I hear from young people, the whole system needs to go. We need a constitutional convention. Throw the whole thing out. If you're telling me to vote, Professor Myerson, you're part of the problem.
Okay, well, I might be part of the problem, but I will maybe because I'm optimistic. And I also think if you're waiting for a revolution, a whole lot of harm's going to happen to a whole lot of people until that revolution happens. So I'm more concerned with how I can minimize harm to all these different groups and all these different people now. But let's just stop a second and realize that everything you said is correct. It is corrupt. There's dark money and there's uneven money. All that is true. On the other hand, we had a president not long ago who was going to do anything to stay in power. He was going to do anything, including lead an insurrection. And guess what? He's not in office at the moment. Somehow the system bungled through and worked. Somehow someone who was so intent on staying in power did not. Something happened. And if you look at Georgia, we had 2 Democrats elected against all odds. Things happened. And so right now we are able to talk about possibilities that seemed very unlikely not that many years ago. So no, we have a fragile system, but gosh, it just worked. I always think the coolest thing in early American history was when George Washington decided not to run for re-election and said, that's enough. And the idea that you don't have a president for life and that people can, or John Adams, even better, the next president, John Adams lost an election. And I always say April 3rd, 1801 is the most important day in American history because a president who wanted to stay in power left. He left Washington. Now he did it at night, so he didn't go to the inauguration. He had a little fit, but he left because that's the rules. Now, Trump also left. Now he's still complaining. He's still saying he won, but we got rid of a president who wanted to stay in office. That's magical. And that's by voting. Now, are people trying to take away votes? Absolutely. Do we have to fight? Absolutely. Do we need a lot of flashlights? Absolutely. But the starting point is we are in a system now where someone desperate to stay in power is not in power today. That's why voting matters.
Why then isn't in the Constitution, the original Constitution, Mike? Why is, again, I keep harping on this, Justice Barrett, it's a civic right. It's not an individual right.
A lot
Whatever
of
that
different,
means.
yeah, no, yeah, I'm not sure what it means. I'm going to ignore your question. No, I'm not going to ignore it, but I don't know what it's, I mean, it's not a lesser.
Is that a thing in constitutional law
Uh,
that a civic?
I would hope not. I would hope not.
You're not aware of it.
No, I think it's made up. I think it's one of those things where you worry about when courts make up statements and say some rights are more important than others. Because to me, the answer to your earlier question, though, is the framers were not sure what they thought of voting. They were kind of scared of the people. They also, you could argue they were slave owners. Many of them, they were all aristocrats. They didn't trust. Remember, there's no public education for 30 years after the Constitution. So most of the people there couldn't read or write. And who wants to give them power? So this very complicated structure set up. Starting in around the 1820s and 1830s, there was this sense that of universal voting, meaning universal white male voting, and it became part of an American ethos that finally now I think is largely sort of understood that this is a fundamental right, that you can't have a system that we have without open voting. It just can't be done. There is no limitation without the protection of voting. But remember, if you're in a partisan world where power matters, you're going to have people who are going to want to limit the vote to those who like them or agree with them. And that I find the most scary part of this whole conversation.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? What's happening now around that that you find scary? If you could break that down and translate that a little into stuff that makes sense, in your everyday
Sure.
life.
Okay, so starting on the 1960s, or Martin Luther King probably even in the 50s, there was a sense that voting should not be difficult. Now, you might need a certain qualification in age or neighborhood you live in to vote in that neighborhood, but voting should be made easier, not harder. So we're going to have early voting. We're going to have mail-in voting during COVID. It's good for people to vote. Right now, you're seeing state after state afraid of more people voting and making decision after decision with one purpose in mind: to make it harder to vote. And who is that hardest for? People of color, people on Native American reservations, people in poor neighborhoods, rural neighborhoods. And so what the effect of making voting harder is, since it's not harder for everyone, is that in certain neighborhoods, it's easier to vote. Maybe the white neighborhood, the wealthier, the suburban neighborhood, and then suddenly democracy just falls apart. So every rule that makes voting harder without a real reason is scary to our and threatening to our very system.
Why are the states getting away with this then, Mike? I mean, and how do you push back except by voting? But if you can't vote, how do you do it?
Okay, so that's an important question, and with a lot of different parts. The Supreme Court basically, I think I've heard you use the word gutted the Voting Rights Act that was passed in the mid 1960s. The Justice Department used to look over when states, especially southern states, would change their rules just to make sure they weren't hurting Black voters. The Supreme Court, sort of out of the blue, in my opinion, in a truly one of those opinions that makes me just sad to even think about teaching, because it seemed so result oriented, limited the ability of the Justice Department to protect the right to vote. From that point on, you have rule after rule going on that make it harder to vote. So the question is, what do you do? Number one, if you got to line up for 8 hours to vote, I hate to say it, you line up for 8 hours to vote, and you encourage people to vote. I was on a group of lawyers who were fielding phone calls during the last election, trying to make sure people weren't being lied to about where to vote and how to vote. So one is that it's everyone's responsibility to maximize the number of people who vote. Second, we have to pass new laws to guarantee the right to vote. And this is where it was one of the lesser priorities of this administration. If I'm going to get political, it should have been the first. It should have been the number one thing to do, was make sure you at least go back to where we were in the mid 1960s. And that, I think that opportunity was lost, and I'm hoping we get another shot at doing that. And third is, don't let them make you give up on the game. Don't make them think voting does. I mean, you got to work harder to vote. I hate it. I'm going to keep working on the vote. I'm going to keep challenging it. And just like with gerrymandering, the Supreme Court said, don't come to us for gerrymandering. It's too hard for us. So what's happening? Maryland's court, North Carolina's courts, the state courts have stepped in. There's so many ways to keep fighting, but to give up, I think, is too frightening to even consider. That's the frightening part to me, that good people give up. That's what should not ever happen.
That's the piece that I think people like you and I are positioned to address for the younger generation potentially. You know, we're so mired in black and white thinking, and there's a safety, there's a comfort zone to be on your team and to think this is the popular way to think. It happens, of course, in youth, but it even happens in grown up, real adult. This is the popular way to think. In teaching for so many years, right, and having to dislodge sort of this idea of reactive thinking, training people to be more curious. Are there things, Mike, that you would tell, someone who's not in law school but is in their late teens, early 20s, and really worried about this, really feeling disempowered? We talked about voting, but in terms of how to problem solve through this, Have you seen some trends, and do you have any guidance you can give on how they can turn that flashlight on for themselves?
Okay. So you don't want to, I'm always afraid to speak about generations as too broad and generalizing. But one thing about the current young generation, they have a clarity of vision that is actually beautiful, a sense of right and wrong and what justice means that I think, in my opinion, is probably the clearest of any generation I've seen, both historically and throughout my lifetime. So that's your starting point. There are things that matter. There are things like justice, but not everyone necessarily agrees. So you have to, in my opinion, I know we both tell our students this, imagine how a good person could disagree with you. Could a good person disagree with you on abortion, on affirmative action, on immigration rights? And there's not a doubt in my mind that a good, honest person could disagree. Now, if they're bigots, if they're haters, if they're saying, this group, doesn't belong here, or these women should be kept back, locked back in the 1940s, that's not legitimate. But we have to find ways of listening to decent arguments we don't like. Not everyone who disagrees with us is evil. And so once you start from that point, I think you also get better at persuading. Now we're in trouble here because whether it's the internet, whether it's cable news, everyone's in their silos, in their tribes, everyone distrusts everyone else. But I think if you care, if you want to be a leader, a true intellectual leader, a thought leader, a policy leader, you have to realize where a good person could disagree with you. And that's your opening question. How could a good person disagree with me? And on some issues, no way a good person could disagree with me that enslaving people is a good idea. No one could argue that anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic hatred is good. No way. But on issues like abortion, on issues like affirmative action or immigration, for example, gun rights, for example, you mentioned Second Amendment. A good person could be on either side of that debate. And if you know that, then you start changing how you think.
Well, to get a little more granular here, I mean, my experience, in with some of the younger generation, they're also very careful about language. They're very attuned, and I wonder, having taught law students for so long, if you could just weigh in on that notion. When you say, could a good person disagree? I think that the definition of good can go very quickly when they hear certain words. So maybe you can give us an explanation from your experience, who you are, what you mean by a good person, and how does this idea that, well, using certain language and not using certain language is really important if I'm going to see you as a good person.
Okay,
I mean,
so
I'll just be honest. I think that's kind of getting a little knotted, and we're losing some of these bigger pictures. That's my experience. I'm interested in your views on that.
So when I say a good person, I mean that in one way, however you want to define it. If you think you are a good person, someone could be just as good as your own standard of what good means. But it's also defined by the negatives. Not a bigot, not someone who hates, not someone who is, and I always think, not someone who is a bad thinker, who enjoys being ignorant. So when I say a good person, it's almost, in my mind, first of all, impossible to define, but I kind of know the opposite. So haters are not good in my definition. Bigots are not, racists not, transphobic people. But you can find a goodness where people can, first of all, I tell my students, if I train you right, you can disagree with someone on Monday and work with them on Tuesday. I'll never be able to work with a Klansman. I just won't be able to. But I'll be able to work with a lot of people who disagree with me on a lot of fundamental issues because there's something decent in my definition of decency, something smart in my definition of intelligence. So it's really, when you look in the mirror and say, this is the kind of person I want to be, there are people who disagree with you who may be that same kind of person. That's what I'm saying is good.
How, I guess what I'm trying to say, I'm just going to be flat out a question of terminology, pronouns, certain language now that is considered disrespectful. Is it possible to be a good person and maybe not be completely on board with some of these things or make mistakes? I mean, how do you handle mistakes. I think there's this confusion. How do I sort who is good? One way to determine who is good, when you say transphobic, oh, they say a point of view. That's not my point of view on how much respect we should give this notion for some people that gender is completely, completely just a social construct, for example. And if you don't understand that gender is a social construct, and you use language that's gendered, you're not in my good person position. How do you how do you get around that, or how do you push through that? Because the response could be, I'm actually am a good person. I'm just not fully understanding that part of the language shift for myself. And then there you go, you're in a head-to-head combat.
I think it's a really complicated question. I find personally people should be more willing to forgive mistakes. That I think that to be human is to make mistakes, and we're all growing. The world is changing. And I think you allow people their trespasses, as they used to say. So I think part of this is part of it is how does someone respond to being corrected? Now, one is they go, oh my gosh, I did not know that was an offensive term. Certainly in my lifetime, I've seen terms suddenly fall, not just out of fashion, but be considered really you just don't say X or Y anymore. And, my parents' generation took longer to learn, and then my kids' generation, shorter time to learn. But, I can still make a mistake. I guarantee I'll make a mistake because I'm still learning. Now, you tell me don't say X. And I go, if it's for your integrity and your personality, I'm going to try, but I got to be allowed to disagree on certain issues. It's just life is more complicated, and we can have different values and still respect each other. You have the right to demand my respect. I think I have the right to demand yours. And that means, again, allowing people to not be perfect, allowing people to grow and change. I happen to think it's really sad when someone in their 20s or 30s is attacked for what they did in their teens. I think children should be allowed to grow and make mistakes. I think adults too. Now, I think you can be harsher on me than on someone much younger, but we're all human. We all make mistakes, and we all should sort of be gentle a little with one another while demanding respect. I think everyone has the right to define themselves, and all that pronouns, all that stuff is part of people being able to define themselves and the rest of the society respecting that self-definition. But
But I think you're right, it goes both ways, right? So yeah, I think that's a really critical determination. And I love the word respect. It's such a defining feature of how I sort, and it doesn't mean agreement, right? It doesn't mean agreement. It means respect. Just before we have to wrap up, and we spoke about a lot, and as I mentioned, I think there's an energy. Again, we're both educators with students with that sort of mindset, that stage of life, and there's a range, but I'm law students somewhere in their 20s to 30s, wanting to know, okay, what do we do now? How do we fix this, Professor Myerson? What are the one, two, three takeaways from this that I can implement this afternoon? Because I really need a roadmap. I really need a methodology. What can you tell me?
Okay, step one is sort of knowing who you are, because the next step depends on where you are and what makes you feel authentic. What I've learned is most of the change I've fought for in the last long period of time is micro. So I feel better when I can make a small change, a small improvement. That to me is where I feel better. Other people may want to be on the streets demanding big change. Both are necessary. So one of the things is know who you are and commit yourself to using who you are at the moment, big or small. That's number one. Number two, educate yourself. Know more, learn. Step 2B is learn about others. How could people disagree with you? And finally, celebrate small victories. Gosh, you're not going to win all of them, and you may lose more than you win, but every small victory gives you hope. I once heard someone, in fact, the person who invented public access for cable television got an award. And he gave this line, and it's motivated and haunted me forever, which is, don't get tired, they never do. They have more lawyers, they got more money. So I think the last thing is just don't get tired. That means don't get disheartened. Celebrate your victories, get educated, find allies, forgive opponents. And just each day, small victories.
Well, thank you for that. I'm inspired and motivated. And I think about this a lot, and I always, without fail, every conversation with you, formal or informal, I learn something. So, Professor Mike Myerson, thank you so much for being on Simple Politics with me today.
Thank you, Kim. I had a great time.